China says it will retaliate against tariff increases from the Trump administration. After negotiations in Washington last week, President Trump insists that U.S. tariffs will hurt the Chinese economy. He tweeted this morning that China had a great deal almost completed, but that they backed out. So Politico trade reporter Megan Cassella is in Washington and joins me this morning. Megan, so we are all bracing for some sort of retaliation from China, but what could that look like? Are we just talking sort of tariffs for tariffs, or are there other options as well?
At this point, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. Tariffs would sort of be the obvious and the easiest answer. But the simple reality is that we don't export nearly as much to China as they send to us. So they're not going to be able to tariff quite as many goods as the U.S. has imposed tariffs on already. So they have other options. It might look like making life just more difficult for U.S. companies trying to operate in China or trying to sell to China. They might be increased inspections at the border. Delays in approvals for banks or loans or other things like that, sort of, myriad options for in-kind retaliation, if you will. So it's not tariffs, it's not strictly something that will cost more money, but it might cost more time, it might make it harder to sell into the Chinese market.
So it sounds like whatever China does will have an impact on American companies. I know the president also floated the idea of now increased taxes on some of the other stuff that's not already being taxed that's coming from China. Just what sort of impact are we talking about for consumers?
For consumers, I mean, if you think about it, if I'm an American company that's buying something from China and it suddenly costs more money, I, as the importer, am the one that's paying more. And so companies have to sort of respect their bottom line. They need to pass on those costs to American consumers. So what that means then is it's higher prices, either because companies are suddenly paying tariffs or because they have to change up their supply chains and find different suppliers that might not be based in China that are still going to be more expensive, very likely. And so, the biggest thing is just the cost increases for consumers.
Right. So the president tweeted on Friday that China is actually paying tariffs directly to the United States Treasury. So that's a good thing because it's more money for the Treasury. But is that how tariffs work?
It's not quite how tariffs work, no. And so the economists that I talk to every day are always saying, I feel like a broken record. But tariffs are paid by importers and then ultimately passed on to consumers. It's not something that it's not like China's handing, some money over to the U.S. Treasury. That's not how it works.
So long before this latest round in the trade war, we here at CBS have been doing stories about the impact of the previous trade war, or sort of ongoing, the impact that it was having on farmers, particularly soy farmers. And farmers were sort of firmly supporting the president, but he had also promised some sort of help. What kind of help can he give them?
So what the administration has done so far is they allocated $12 billion to help farmers. And what that largely did was it was largely sent through direct payments to farmers. And it helped them, farmers who are suddenly getting lower prices for their soybeans or who are stockpiling their grains and hoping that they can just sell them later when trade tensions are lower. And what we've seen now with these latest threats and latest rounds of tariffs is that the administration is committing, and they're saying, we'll do that again if we have to. We will, send more aid to farmers. There's a whole number of issues with that. Farmers, for one, their rallying cry has sort of been trade, not aid. We don't want direct handouts. I mean, yes, it's helpful when a farmer might not have been making money for the past several months or didn't get the profit that they wanted from their latest crop. It is helpful in some ways to get that payment, but it's not exactly what they want. They would rather sell their products all over the world, including to China and to other countries, rather than sort of get what many view as a handout.
So then, Megan, where do we go from here? On Thursday, Chinese negotiators were here in Washington. They worked all, sort of late into the evening. They had dinner, but still nothing sort of ended up happening. What's the next move?
So the next move, the only thing we really know for sure is what White House Economic Director Larry Kudlow said yesterday. And he said that the Chinese have invited the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and probably the Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin back to Beijing. But there's no specific plans in place as to when they might go, what the talks will look like exactly. And the only sort of timeline that we really have so far is that Kudlow also hinted that Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping might be able to meet sort of on the sidelines of the G20 in Japan at the end of June. And so that gives us roughly 6 weeks if they want to try to work, if the two sides at a lower level want to try to work something out before then, we might see a meeting between Trump and Xi sometime next month. And that's sort of the timeline that we're looking at now.
Well, the president says that they get along. He certainly values his personal relationships that he has with leaders, so maybe that will do the trick. But 6 weeks is a long time. Megan Cassella, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.